I might just kick it off. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Before we begin, on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here with us today. So let's get started. So for those of you who haven't met, my name's Amanda Price. I'm the head of High Growth Ventures. We're a team within KPMG that's 100% dedicated to working with startups. And we've developed a range of products and offerings that are specifically designed and priced for startups starting at pre-Series A and beyond. Thanks, I was just saying before, thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We have a heap of questions that I've used as the sort of the basis for the conversation today, but please feel free to send the questions through. I'll be looking at the chat, and it's actually great if we have that sort of interaction as well, so feel free to do that. I've just turned that on. Topic for today, just in case you don't know which Q&A you have dialed into, is how to build a winning finance function as you scale. We're joined by two people who are extremely well qualified to explore this topic with us today. So they're Josh Geelan, a partner and ESG lead, and Eddie Moe, director in enterprise. Big welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. I thought, as I said before, I'll throw to you guys and just get you to say a few words about what you do and why you are qualified to talk on this topic. Josh.
No worries. Thanks, Amanda. My name's Josh Geelan, so I'm a partner in KPMG Enterprise. I'm based down here in sunny Tasmania. As you can see, it's a bit chilly this morning. But I work with my clients nationally on ESG and also Outsource CFO. I've got a bit of a diverse background, so I had about 8 years in public practice working for mid-tier firms. I then got bored of that and went out and became a CFO for a fintech startup in Sydney. We went through family and friend raise, Series A, Series B, and then institutional as well. So that was an absolute roller coaster journey, and I learned a lot going through that. I then left that and went to the US and set up a tech business over there. For about 2 years, and that was both fun and a nightmare, as people heard me talk about that in the past will know. But intimately understand that pain and that pressure and the excitement that goes with having your own startup and then going through that journey to sale at the end of the journey as well. So I now work here at KPMG, once again, as Amanda said, with ESG and also Outsource CFO. And I really love working with high growth ventures and helping them on their journey. So love and really looking forward to this discussion today.
Eddie.
Thanks. So as Amanda mentioned, I'm a director within KPMG Enterprise, and I lead the New South Wales Tech Advisory team, focusing on small to mid-sized clients. So predominantly what I do around tech advisory is everything that falls under the IT strategy banner. And it's a very wide banner, but looking at every sort of question or discussion that an organization might go through when they come to IT, right? And sometimes it comes to the investment decision. So when do we upgrade? When do we look to move to a new ERP? Answering those sort of questions. Maybe when we use CRM, when do we use other sort of product management tools? How do we set up some of the processes and projects and delivery programs, and ultimately form a bit of a roadmap, right? So it's not a lot of organizations, it's not a one step and one transaction type journey. It is actually sort of a number of steps that they need to go through. And it's part of the journey is actually, how does it match with where the business is going? And this is a really interesting space, especially with sort of small businesses or startups, because the journey can vary quite a lot. And so the technology options that are out there and the story there and the questions that get asked are really varied, right? And we need to start to account for different scenarios. And so, look, I've been part of, I started my career, so just coming back to me, I started my career with IBM. From the first 8 years, worked with a lot of large corporate enterprises naturally. Similar to Josh, went into a mid-market enterprise which focused more on smaller clients, and so I really got to know clients from sort of ground up, and I'm always interested in hearing founders and startups journeys because it's always interesting. But in terms of working with those clients, so working with your sort of typical accounting platforms and trying to identify processes and sort of work on that micro level, and then naturally talk about the transition upwards. So look, really excited to be here today to have this chat. And hopefully I'll be able to provide some guidance on some of the IT questions that are going to come up.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. I mean, I'm surprised. I'm actually excited about. I mean, building a winning finance function is, I didn't think I would be as excited as I am to talk about it, but I am, because we talk about it with so many clients, and with my background as well in startups, it was obviously a really key challenge that we had. So I sort of keen to kick it off. Now, when we talked, Josh and Eddie, in the pre-call, we sort of thought about the finance function in 3 pieces, which is people, process, and tools. And so I'll use that, let's go through it in that order, but using I thought it would be good to use some scenarios. So for example, let's start early. So I'm an early stage founder. I've got a bookkeeper or part-time accountant. The business is doing reasonably well. Costs are I'm still worried about spending money on, putting people on, especially in finance areas. I'm still spending too much time in finance, and the resources that I've got probably aren't giving me the insights that I need. So I'm quite in the weeds with it. So I'm starting to think about, what are my options? So in my mind, I can put on a full-time CFO, or I can look at outsourced CFO options. So I thought with that, it might be good just to throw, I might throw to you, Eddie, or actually I'll start with you, Josh, on this one in terms of, let's start with the people. So what are the things I need to, how do I start to think about making that decision? What are the things I have to start to consider?
So for me, I like to flip that on its head, Amanda. So I like to think about, as a business, where are you now, but also where do you want to be, and how are you going to get there? And when you start thinking about that strategic play and over what time period that's going to play out, I like to reverse engineer that and think about, well, what do we actually need to know? Like, who are our stakeholders? Because the finance function is obviously going to be so much more than just a P&L or a tax return. It really should be a narrative that supports the business. So that's really important information for you as founders. But also for third parties, so banks and third-party investors, as you go through those capital raises on that journey, you want to build confidence and trust in your business with those third parties. You want them on that journey. You want to know inherently what those drivers for success are, but also what the sensitivities are. So when I was working with the fintech, I was involved from day one when it was a startup with about $50 in the bank, through the point where it had about $100 million in the bank. So that journey ultimately changed and got to the point where they need someone more senior than me at that time to actually run that function. So it's about the right person at the right time, and it's about getting the right degree of automation at the right time. But the one thing we did really well when I was working with that company was really being super clear on what success looked like and what those drivers for success were. And we reported on that every single week to ourselves and to our third-party stakeholders and kept them on the journey. But we also knew what failure looked like. We knew what the sensitivities were. We knew what the thresholds for those were. And we were really open and honest with all parties about what they were and actually reported on those as well. So we knew if this particular metric got to X, we were in a lot of trouble. And so we had a strategy to keep it under that, and we'd actually report on it. And that gave a lot of confidence and trust to those third parties. Made the friends and family very easy, but made the Series A and Series B also quite easy relatively, because they had that long-term confidence in who we were, where we're going, and how we intended to achieve it. So to answer your question, Amanda, it really comes down to that function, that person needs to support strategy, the narrative, and the information for decision making. And it really comes down to depending what the business is. So in the fintech, it really was a decision. Well, you know what, we use Xero, and it was a great tool, for example. But we also had a custom ERP that we're building off the back of it, which automated a lot of the functions. And that was deliberate, and it was the right solution for that business because we could automate it, and then we knew we wanted to scale, and we knew we could scale, and we had the strategy and the plan to do that. But for others, that doesn't make sense, and they may end up using a much smaller solution for a much longer time. And I'll throw to Eddie. Eddie's going to have a lot more insights in terms of me about those complexities and what those solutions look like.
But actually, before we go, just in terms of the people side, so if we think about the type, again, going back to what's if we think about what decisions, what do I have to factor in when I'm trying to make a decision? Do I put on, I think that one of the questions actually I'll read out, because I think it positions it well. It says, given that cash flow is a significant issue with a scaling business, how can a business weigh up the financial obligations associated with a CFO, or could they put on an outsourced CFO? So I think it's like, trying to think through, like, how do founders think through that decision?
Yeah, okay, sorry. So the way I like to think about that then is, as a small business, it's going to sound a bit biased, but I do like that idea of an outsourced CFO, because you don't necessarily want a full-time CFO. And if you do want a full-time CFO, it comes down to what does that cost? And a lot of startups can't pay $100,000 or $200,000 and $400,000 for the CFO at that right level for that stage of their business. And you've also got to think about the right CFO for now and where you've been versus the right CFO for where you want to go in a year's time, 2 years' time. So that means you're going to be listed. Obviously, you're going to need quite a strong corporate reporting and governance-based CFO. But for the whole journey, you want a really strong strategic CFO. So it's a lot easier to find a bookkeeper or a really strong, GL accountant. It's quite hard, and obviously as a firm that employs 12,000 of these people, it's quite hard to find really good strategic people. But that is exactly the person you want for your business in that role, and also that's the right cultural fit as well. So the way I like to think about it for startups is the benefit of an outsource model is you can actually buy in that expertise. You can find someone who has that skill set that you want, has the resources behind them to pull in other resources, but you're not paying for it full time, because often you don't need that full time. And then you can actually free your budget up to make sure that your numbers and the governance around your finances are really robust. So good process, good people, good bookkeepers, good general ledger sort of accountants. Spend the bulk of your money there, and then buy in that strategic piece as you need it while you grow. There will come a point, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later, when it does make sense to get an in-house resource. And a lot of large companies will still use outsource as well, but we'll talk about that as well. So that's the way I would like to think about it, is you want to make sure that you work on the business, not just in the business. And that goes for founders and the CFO as well.
Yeah. Eddie, I might throw to you on that, a few views, the pros and cons.
Yeah, and so look, Josh has gone into a fair bit of detail, and look, I think the CF role itself is quite a large role and does encompass, I think, in my view, and I'm not the finance expert here, but it does have different lenses and different skill sets that are required. And I think what Josh mentioned is, the different time of the business has different needs. And I think most important from my perspective, if you're going to go out and look at a CFO, it's not necessarily always about the cost implications. It's actually about the return and the benefit. And I think Josh should have touched on this, some of the benefits that you're going to get out of it, right? Whether there is some process efficiency, whether they are able to support the founder, perhaps in maybe some sales or revenue generation activities, or help in that sort of series, different series A, B, different funding type discussions. They have different lenses, and in my mind, when you go about making that decision on a CFO, and look, it's a bit of a consulting speak, but it depends, right? To me, one of the most critical fundamental factors is actually trust between the founder or the director or whoever that lead person is and the CFO, and they need to be sort of a really tight relationship, because the last thing you want to have is a CFO that you can't work with, or they don't have the same view or the same strategic mindset or the same sort of journey that they're willing to go on, and then that causes a whole bunch of process issues. And so when you do go to, and I guess in speaking in my experience in terms of outsource CFO, or outsource function, one thing that does create is actually a baseline in my mind. It does help create trust straight away that you have an organization or a team that does sort of form that basis that you can trust. And then perhaps you don't need that CFO, or you can still supplement that with a CFO that might be more focused and maybe able to spend more time on strategic type drives or different initiatives. So to me, there is, for me, it comes down to quite a basic principle of just a relationship and the person. And once you have the person that's in there, you can supplement that with other type systems or processes or organizations.
Yeah, I think the other side, when you're that early, I mean, a CFO, that is it's generally quite a significant cost for a non-revenue generating role. And I suppose my view is, and it's not to do with, it's to do with my experience actually of going as being a founder, and the reason we offer outsourced CFOs, because I absolutely 100% believe in that product. And when I was in the US, I was in the US for 8 years with a startup. I mean, no one had, it's very different culturally in that way. No one had full-time CFOs on until Series B or C. Everyone outsourced it. So I suppose, so someone said, how is it not about the cost? It is about the cost. I'm saying it's about the cost. I say it is. It's a really, I think in that moment, if you can access some of that strategic piece and get the work done so you're not so in the weeds, then to me, it's sort of, that's super helpful.
Yeah, look,
sorry, you go, Eddie.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, so it's not so much bypassing the cost. I think it's more about the return. And for me, just to always have that in the back of your mind as well, that not every CFO is the same. But if you are going to invest in someone, look, it's not a pure cost decision in my mind. Sometimes it is worthwhile paying a little bit more, but you get so much more return. I think, especially as a startup, in my mind, time is actually very critical. And if you have someone you can trust and you can rely on to cover that function for you, it does free up time, which then focus, and that time is value in regards to the growth of the organization.
I think on that as well, that one of the worst things you can do as a startup is employ someone at too high level straight off the bat, say as a full-timer, because first of all, you're not going to have to work for them. So they're going to do bookkeeping and GL roles that you don't need to pay someone that much money for, plus probably get bored and leave. Then we've got to find another one, which is not the support you need as a founder. And secondly, if you go too cheap, you're not going to get the strategy and the genuine insights and the be held accountable that you need as a founder as well. So it's really hard to get that balance right, but you do want to get that right, because both of those are going to end up burning you and actually cost you even more money.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other side is when it seems to me, this is I have no fact in this at all, but just again, working with so many founders, the turnover of that CFO role seems really high to me. And so it's sort of like, that's with, with the outsourced CFO role, at least then the responsibility is on the outsourced CFO to make sure, if that outsourced CFO leaves, it's their responsibility to train the next person up and make sure that your service is seamless, not the founders. And so again, you're not sort of training someone up for them to leave and having to waste all that time. I don't know. It just seems at an early stage, I feel like having a full-time CFO, if you can not have it, it's a better decision not to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So move on. Great. So in terms of, again, if we think about the processes and systems, Eddie, I'll throw to you. So again, early stage, what systems do you recommend, processes?
Yeah, and look, it's a question that I get asked a lot. What is the right system? When do we move? And look, again, not to go to the consultant speak in terms of it depends, and startups vary quite a lot. But in my mind is you don't always need to move to an ERP, right? And this is a discussion sometimes I do have with founders where they do come to me and they go, we're X millions of dollars turnover now, it's time for us to move. And the question I come back to is why, right? Because in my experience, I've dealt with 100 million, 200, actually even a $400 million business that still had MYOB as their core finance system at the back end. It was running very well, all right? And that's perfectly fine because it fit what they needed. They needed a GL to have the system. So it's not always a question of you hit this size and therefore you need to move, right? To me, it's a question of what are you looking to drive out of it, and are there actually limitations that you're currently facing with your system that is actually forcing you? So, to me, it's a question of do you have to make that investment? I think it's and moving to an ERP, it is quite a large investment. It's not something that's just a few $1,000s. It is tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars to move to that, and it does commit you for a fair bit of time, and it does inhibit the organization from some adaptability or some flexibility. So for me, there's a lot of questions to be answered from a business sense before you get into the technical questions. Now, once you do I do caveat that by saying there are some technical limitations to some of these systems, right? And I talk about, those accounting systems typically being MYOB, QuickBooks, Xero are sort of the three main ones, potentially Sage. And look, the first thing is if you are on the on-prem version or the ones that are stored up on your home desktop, first thing is you need to get to the cloud platform, right? So if you're in Xero, you're fine. If you're on MYOB, hopefully you're on one of the newer versions where you are up in the cloud and data stored up in the cloud. But if you're on anything that's on-prem, that's older than that, move into a cloud version, right? So that's definitely one technical thing to move on to. But otherwise, the accounting platforms there's a few limitations, which firstly is the transactions. So the actual transaction count is quite large and too large. So those platforms I spoke of, they do have millions of transactions. And like I said, you can have a really large organization that still operates within the transition limit. But I have worked with an organization that was only a $5 million turnover, and because they were an online wagering business, they had to do a transaction every time someone put a bet down, and so they needed to do the liability and the asset sort of calculations there. So every time they need to put that transaction through, so therefore their transaction count went very high, very smart, very early on, and they need to hit that limit. So there are limits, and look, it's a transaction count. It's the multiple organizations. So if you do, for whatever reason, have sort of various companies that you start to set up for tax purposes or other reasons, that starts to take into account, and the cross company transactions. Those of you that are looking to go international, the currency question comes up, and whether you can handle the different currencies and exchange rates and those sort of mechanisms. And then look, the other sort of factor, which is probably more organization wise, is the security measures, right? So if you are on those platforms, they only have 2 or 3 roles of security measures. And so if you have access to raise a bill and an invoice, you also can get access to seeing the bank account details and how much cash is being held and those sort of. So there are those sort of limitations, which if you do want to start to segment that, that's when you start looking into an ERP platform that does start to separate roles, responsibilities, and security measures. Those are sort of the baseline questions to start off with. And then we start looking into sort of more the wider questions around, do you want to automate some processes? Do you want to have sort of improved data visualization? Do you want to link it up with other systems and processes in your organization? And that's sort of when the real value starts to get driven.
Eddie, with the ERPs, there's a question that's come through around which ERPs would you recommend once you've hit the ceiling of Xero or MYOB?
Look, that's a really good question. And look, I would say, look, firstly, it depends on what you're looking for and what the strengths of your organization are going to be. And look, very generically, I'd say the natural jump is moving into a NetSuite, moving to a Microsoft Dynamics Business Central, or even Finance and Operations. And I'm probably going to miss out on a whole bunch of ERPs here that need to be mentioned, but there's the Oracle ERP Cloud, there's MYOB Advanced, to those of you who just want to stick with MYOB. And look, there is a raft of others, right? But there is not, and the reason why there is such a selection is because each one of them does have their own sort of strengths in respective industries or specific processes, right? And so it's not a single answer. You can imagine in this super competitive state, if there was one that could nail all the different types of businesses and organizations, they would be smashing the market. But the reason why there is choice is because each organization has its best fit.
Just a quick one, another one's just come through. I think this might be one, I'm not quite sure who this is for. What is the transaction limit or range for Xero or MYOB QuickBooks?
Quickly off the top of my head, I think it's around 1 million transactions a day. I think something along those lines. It's quite large. That for most organizations, you wouldn't strike it. But obviously, on the rare occasion, as I mentioned, that sort of online betting platform, they did get that transaction. Well, they did have that as a concern because they were hoping to get a high number of wagers through.
Yeah, and actually, what's interesting, Eddie, the couple of times I've had a few founders who wanted to go to ERP solutions. I think you actually talked them out of that. And I was talking to Josh about that another time. And Josh, I think you were saying there's someone an investor or someone that you've worked with that is absolutely anti-ERP solutions and really wants founders to stay on Xero. Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've worked with clients before who are $500 million plus still using Xero and Excel sheets and doing really well, making a lot of money. I've got clients who turn over $1 million a year and have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in ERPs that add no value. And of course, there was plenty of success stories of ERPs as well. But in that outsource CFO role, one of my clients is a family office, and he has a lot of business interests as well. We actually outsource the CFO for the family office and him as a high net worth individual, but also some of those businesses. And he is very, very clear when he goes and buys or acquires one of these business or these targets. He says to them, if you're not on Xero, do not overcomplicate this. If you don't need bells and whistles to tell you what you need to know about your business, don't buy bells and whistles. Don't spend your time with it. Don't confuse the matter. Really distill what you do need to know as a founder and what your stakeholders need to know, and just do that really, really well. And get rid of that white noise, because it's quite easy to get distracted with all this other stuff. And we've all seen profit and loss reports and board reports that are this thick that no one reads and no one understands, versus a very simple one page where it says, this is how we're going, this is where we're going, are we on track, are we growing? So he's really, really demanding of that. So when I front up as his outsourced CFO and represent him in that capacity as well, we are super clear and it's straight to the point, and that's what drives success in the business and the family office that he has.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got another couple of questions I'm just going to throw to, and one of this is, which I think is one thing that people always ask about, is the cost efficiency of this CFO role. Like, how do you actually judge that, assess that? Is it just a factor of time, or are there further cost efficiencies with outsourcing? For a startup doing, say, 3 million in revenue, how much might they be looking to pay if they outsource the CFO role? I don't know whether there's a direct correlation, but I'll throw to you, Josh, in terms of just chatting through some of the, again, it comes down to that decision making. How do I think about it?
Yeah, that's right. Look, and it depends what you need. So we've got clients at that sort of fee range, so that revenue range, who engage with firms like KPMG to do everything from bookkeeping, month-end reconciliation and reporting, and that strategic CFO piece, where we actually come out and you get a dedicated partner representing you. That can cost a couple of grand, it could cost 10 grand. But likewise, we have heaps of clients who just want a lighter touch. They've got their own bookkeeper, they've got their own GL accountant, but they just want us to come in and be that support from that strategic level, have conversations with them, be that commercial standing board, and give third parties confidence that KPMG is in their corner. And that can cost very little, to be honest. And that's where we get the efficiencies. So it's really working out what tasks do we need to do in this business, and what's the most efficient way to do that. And so you want to make sure that you've got the bookkeepers and the sort of more generalist accountants doing as much as they possibly can at those lower cost prices, and you're only paying higher prices for that really strategic piece that you need. And what we often see is people go to market and pay 100 grand, 200 grand, or whatever it is to get a CFO, or would have to if they wanted to, but they don't have a full-time job for that person. But in the absence of not outsourcing it, that's what people tend to do. So it's really just about reimagining what you actually need, and that's typically where we see the savings. So we do generally see savings. There are certainly cases where we don't, in which case we wouldn't necessarily propose to go down that pathway, but I would say most of the time we can achieve a cost saving even for startups.
And Josh, with that, so let's think about as we're transitioning. So I'm a bit, I'm that same founder. It's 2 years later. I've had my outsourced CFO. Do you often find that the person, do people start to hire someone to move into that outsourced CFO so they can work with you? You know, how do you work, or if there's an existing CFO, how do you work with them? How do you sort of make that transition?
Yeah, great question. So what we see is if we're doing a very hands-on role, as the journey progresses towards IPO, obviously that CFO function starts taking a lot more corporate governance and shareholder relations with the listing rules as well. So that's the point at which it would definitely make sense to have an internal CFO, and quite a good one, to support you in that process. Often though, we are still retained to provide services to them, and we're there to then support. And I saw the question before come up about how to work with existing CFOs as well. And it was a great question from, I think it was Fabio. So it really comes down to what sort of person they've got and what weaknesses they have. My experience as a CFO was it's quite a lonely role. You're there, it's to totally depend on you. The founders are depend on you. Third parties are effectively giving you their confidence and trust and depend on you as well. It's really hard to be everything to everyone. So what I really appreciated when I was working at that fintech was the outsourced CFO we had at the time. I could lean on that person, I could tap into their expertise and also the firm's expertise to draw upon those resources and skill sets as the curly questions come in, to make sure I wasn't, one, providing the best possible advice, and where I didn't know what I was doing, I'd go and find someone who did, basically. So our role tends to transition more to support and really providing those niche and expertise areas to support that CFO. Sometimes they'll have a really, really strong CFO and pay a lot of money for that person 9 times out of 10, and they need a lot less support. Other times they'll go for someone a bit lower level and they need a lot more support. And that's just a business decision, and also availability of resources in the current climate as well. Yeah,
and just a question, Kevin, what are your thoughts on getting an experienced GA accountant to grow into the CFO role as the company grows? So it might just be worth Josh already just touching on the differences. What's the difference between the accountant and the CFO? And do you see that transition? Is that a natural transition that most people move into that role from accountant?
No, it's not. We have seen it done successfully. The big thing for me, and this is a challenge for us firm as well, so I can say it pretty honestly, but if you think about a lot of good technical accountants, if you think of your stereotypical accountant, and then you think about what makes a good CFO, who's going to provide you really robust and strategic advice as a CFO, often they're two different things that you're thinking about. And so what I often say is you want both in your business. You want the cardigan who's going to sit there and do a fantastic job at pushing out brilliant financials that are robust and accurate on time. But that person, 9 times out of 10, there are some rare exceptions, won't be the best person strategically to help drive that, particularly with investor relations. So it's hard to get that right. And that's where the outsourced strategic piece, which is a much smaller piece where you need it, and the internal, I call it cardigan role, sits quite nicely. Having said that, there are a few instances where I have seen it done quite successfully, where you get someone to come in early and they grow with the business. That can certainly happen. If you find that person, hold on to them, whatever you do, because they are hard to come by. And then send them my way, please, because I can definitely use them as well.
All right, we've got a specific question here for you, Josh. Ready? Love the virtual CFO role. However, I've twice previously outsourced the CFO role to mid-sized firms. On each occasion, it involved both the CFO and bookkeeping roles being outsourced. On reflection, we found that the firm's staff in bookkeeping were not doing their job properly and they were not being properly supervised by the firm. Of course, accordingly, my accounts were not correct. How can KPMG or others guarantee founders that the work performed by external parties are being properly done? Any tips?
Look, that's disappointing, I guess. But we do see it happen. The way we approach it, I obviously can't guarantee anything, but the way we approach it, which hopefully gives more confidence in this, is you get access to a dedicated partner. So it's really that if that's me or one of the other many people we have, obviously at KPMG, it's that personal relationship. You have to expect, and we have to commit that we will be showing up, we will be presenting it, and our reputation goes with that. And that's one of the key differences, I guess, between a big four firm and potentially some smaller firms, is that our brand is everything and our reputations is absolutely everything. You should have the confidence, and your third party should have the confidence that if KPMG is involved, then it's to a very high standard. And we are very, very serious about maintaining that. We also make sure that it's a personal relationship. So I work with my clients 100% personally and my team. And Amanda touched on it before. So if I've got staff that leave, of course they do, and staff everywhere leave, that's my problem. I've got to resource that. And what the one benefit with a bigger firm, once again, is I've got more people at my resources that I can tap into and then pull in quickly to make sure that you've got that continual presence and service as well. But I would find it disappointing across any firm that would happen. I'm not saying we are perfect, because we never are, but certainly that personal approach will hopefully mitigate that as best we can.
Another question from Wayne actually came through. How often do the outsourced CFOs have experience through raises, and what is your perception of its impact with investors? And maybe that sort of speaks to, does that speak to, again, when you need what raise? Is it okay to have a outsourced CFO with some experience in raising it at A, B, or like when do you touched on before about having that in-house role? If you take that and say, with regards to raising, is it like a Series B you need in-house, or how do you actually judge that? And also with outsourced CFOs, do you see many of them having experience in raises and raising capital?
Yeah, that can be really broad. Yes and no. Sorry, I don't know a great answer to this, but yes and no, right? So I think early on, having a big four brand in your corner is a very positive thing, and particularly getting back to that original point I made about you want that CFO role to be building your strategy and building that narrative. So when I was working for the FinTech in Sydney, I reckon one day a week we would spend going around Sydney having coffees with investors, potential investors, even institutional investors really early on. We knew that was going to be 2 or 3 years away, but we wanted to get them on the journey early and build that trust over a long period of time. So I think having a really strong outsourced CFO is very acceptable for friends and family, Series A, Series B. By the time you get to IPO, that would potentially concern me, even institutional. A lot of the institutional investors will say to you, it's all about the confidence of you and the people, right? They can look at the founders, look at the team, look at your advisory board and say, am I buying someone's job or am I buying a business? And a business needs to be brought on just 2 founders or 3 founders. It needs a continuation of skill set. It needs to be in-house. It needs to be dedicated. And we do see that a fair bit. So that's where our role that will then pivot to supporting those people through that process versus potentially being that person. So I guess to answer your question, at the point of institutional, we see both, but at the point of ASX listing, I would definitely say you'd want a really good in-house resource.
Yeah, okay. Just a couple of questions that have come through here too. I thought this was an interesting one. With a CFO as an investor, he's willing to advise. How independent should he be from the accounts?
Yeah, look, a great question. Once again, we see this a lot with employee share schemes and ESOPs and all the other various options that go around those sort of structures. So the FinTech I was part of, I didn't have any shares or options. I was purely there in a contract role. But the person who replaced me, this is about 15 years ago or 13 years ago, the person who replaced me did come in and reissue shares to help motivate them to grow to the next level. And that can work really well. So are they impartial and objective? Well, potentially not. They have that potential conflict, I suppose. But you got to work out what you want Do you want someone coming in to hold you accountable? Or do you want someone coming in to really have some skin in the game and help you grow? And I can argue that, you know, there's two sides that coin in both ways you can structure it. But once again, there's pros and cons either way. It'll come down to what you want to achieve and what your challenges are.
Yeah. And another one, this one's for you, Eddie, in terms of what tech stacks do B2B SaaS companies typically use? Greater than 20 mil ARR, and then brackets NetSuite, question mark.
It's quite a detailed question. Look, I hate to say this, it's going to sound like a broken record, but it does depend. But look, a lot of organizations that we are seeing actually are leveraging a lot of the Microsoft stack more and more, right? Because it is becoming a bit of an enterprise-wide platform, right? So, and Microsoft has strategically started to position a lot of their tools around sort of the enterprise businesses, right? So obviously people use Outlook, Word, Excel, obviously Teams that we're on right now is obviously becoming that collaboration tool. For those of you that know it, Power BI is their sort of that data visualization tool and being able to tap into all the different sources. And then on top of that, they've started to invest a lot in sort of the business platforms, right? So your ERPs, which is Microsoft Business Central and Finance and Operations, they're starting to invest a lot. Microsoft obviously has deep pockets. So not that I'm a Microsoft salesperson here, but that is one that is typically, you know, very generically, it has a tool set. It does have the ability to integrate with all the other parts of the business. And this is a space that Microsoft keeps investing in. You know, and if you asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been Google. Google was leading in this space, right? With everything that Google does, you know, their whole Google suite, NetSuite, like I mentioned, was one that tied really nicely with Google, especially in the sort of startup space and startup language. And, you know, Google obviously had their entire platform and G Suite, Sheets, their Word equivalent. They had all the same sort of tools. And that's what Microsoft is now trying to emulate or I think copy in some regards. So, you know, and 3 or 4 years from now, that conversation might change again. There might be something else that comes along. You know, Salesforce, which has been very CRM driven, is now also looking to build their own sort of enterprise-wide, you know, ERP and other solutions. So, look, it is a changing thing, and with technology, there is obviously, you know, people always continually investing in R&D and building things up. But if you ask me today, right now, I'd probably say Microsoft is a good horse to back just because of their ability to continue to build and evolve.
One of the things we didn't touch on was with ERPs, and we've touched on sort of it's obviously a bigger price point than the standard sort of systems they're using. But just can you just talk about time? Like in terms of, let's say I'm thinking, this is another consideration for me moving to ERP. How much time is it going to take? And is it, you know, for if I don't have a CFO, I'm the founder, like, is it a month, 2 months? What sort of information is needed? And what's I know it's how long's a piece of steel. It depends. It does depend. But, you know, just some of the ones you've worked on, what's the typical timeframes?
Yeah, look, typically it's 3 to 6 months. Because it does take that amount of time to transfer a lot of data and get a lot of setup and get things organized correctly. Because an ERP in itself, it does have a lot of processes and I think most importantly as well, sort of the change management aspect, right? So being a startup, small organization, you have a lot of flexibility, people who wear multiple hats. And, you know, as it already sort of got spoken of, there might be different people with different levels of access and what they need to see or can see. And so when you move into an ERP space, it does systemize a lot of those flexible, or it might restrict people in different ways. And so there is actually quite a change in the organization from a process perspective. And normally that actually takes a fair bit of time to determine and have those discussions with, hang on, you know, you used to be an accountant that did all this. And now all of a sudden you're an accountant that just does AP or AR or you know, a specific set of processes, and you have to stick within that balance because that's what the system's going to restrict you to, right? So those sort of change management processes, that takes a bit of time, as well as a lot of even systemizing a lot of the processes, right? So an ERP, while at the very, very core, the very bottom, it is a GL and it does have the journals as every other system does. The value of the ERP is actually its connection to the other parts of the organization. So how does it connect with the operational systems and potentially even the sales processes? That takes time, right? Whereas an accounting platform is in its own world. You can have spreadsheets all over the place that are running, but the ERP value is actually how does it connect and bring that all together into one house, and that is the big value driver, but it's also a big restrictor in some ways. And so that in itself can also take a lot of time to get that sorted, and maturity in the organization.
And with that, so you just, so when you're talking about the change in the organization, sort of cultural, it must be a bit of a cultural shift. So when you do, say it's 3 to 6 months it takes, is it after that, is the teams being trained on the way through? Is it implemented, then everyone gets training? How long does that typically take, and what sort of cultural impact can it have, good and bad?
Yeah, so look, it can be good because some people do like, having their sort of set task, and they do it, and that's all they want to do. But the biggest cultural impact, especially with startups, naturally, is because startups everyone has flexible, and everyone loves the flexible environment, and maybe doing a bit of sales, maybe doing a bit of operations, dealing with some of the finance, and having sort of multiple hats that they wear. That's the system will then restrict them in what they can do, right? Otherwise, if you are, and this probably feeds into the scale question, right? And so if an organization is looking to grow, right, and I'm just going to say typically organizations look at ERPs, probably start looking at ERPs around 20 people or more. If you're less, you may not be looking, and look, it depends on the organization, right, what is needed. But if you're at roughly around 20 people, you're all of a sudden starting to formulate those 20 people into specific roles or specific areas of the business, right? And that might be a natural transition for the business. So with 20 people, all of a sudden you might say, hang on, I have 5 people that are focused on sales. I have 10 people that are focused on operations, and 5 people that are focused on corporate activities, whether it be HR, payroll, finance, etc. All right, so you start to have those sort of splits, and that's when the ERP plays nicely, because if you have those splits, you can start to formalize those systems and processes in the ERP. But if you have less or more people, and people jump across all different variety of roles, the ERP actually acts as a inhibitor, and it actually takes a lot of time to embed those processes and follow those sort of systems. And and I think Josh mentioned earlier, you can have founders who are very against ERPs because they have other systems in place, spreadsheets or things that are in place to not have those restrictions. Then you can do really well. So hopefully that sort of answers the question around.
It just made me think of, when I was reading through some of the questions this morning that had come through, one of them was, how do I persuade other founders to move to an ERP? So I think you've just talked through some of the benefits, but so obviously there's pushback. Just another one, do you have to move to an ERP, or is there a system that allows you? One of the things is for us, and I think for most small businesses, you're right, you've got your accounting system, then I've got my sales forecasts. I'm sort of trying to do on HubSpot, and so I can see MQLs move to SQLs, but it doesn't show, it doesn't really show forecasting. And is there any system in the middle of an ERP, zero that ERP, that actually sort of combines that would give me a better view of the business, and and show cash flow and my sales and all of that dynamically? Does that exist, or is it you'd have to go into some bigger system?
So look, what I have seen happen, and I think even banks and sort of businesses and investors, ultimately, they want to have some visibility into some of the numbers without obviously being hands-on in some of the systems. And so I mentioned Power BI earlier. I mean, it's a low-cost tool provided by Microsoft that does connect to a whole bunch of different databases, whether it is the HubSpots, your CRMs, your finance systems. It does have a wide range of connectors, and if you have the right person to set it up, it does require quite a technical skill set. But if you have the right person to set it up and tap into all those different databases, they can create quite a nice visualization that then can be sent out, whether it's a PDF or a PowerPoint, or they can actually be shared as a link for a dynamic real-time view on how the current numbers are going, and whether numbers or KPIs are being hit. And so to me, that's sort of the halfway house if you're looking for that visualization tool. It obviously doesn't provide the sort of system processes and the sort of tightness and security around how those numbers are actually formed, but it does actually give a visualization aspect.
Yeah, great. And one just came through. What is your view on the zero practice of having partners that have add-on systems that interact with the base accounting system?
Yeah, and look, that's a really good question, and that's when I think about where Xero came from, And one of the things that it did leverage in is both, firstly, Xero did a really good job of reaching out to the accountant network, right, and getting accountants sold and getting accountants on board, because it gave the single view between the accountant and the business, right? So that was one thing that Xero did well. And the thing that I think really sort of made Xero a leader in this sort of small accounting platform space is the fact they've got that whole marketplace and the integration platforms. And and I think Xero, in the conversations which I've had with them directly, they want to stick to their core, right, which is the GLs, the accounting platforms, right, and they want to leverage that marketplace and the open APIs to give small organizations that ability to tap in to some of these other toolkits, depending on the organization, whether it's a CRM, whether it is inventory management, even just managing expenses and receipts, payroll, workforce, event bookings. So there's a whole range of sort of systems that Xero has made available, and they've created this marketplace and ecosystem to provide small businesses this flexibility to get some of those functions, but still stay within their platform. And obviously that is dependent on the organization picking the right add-on to get into. So one thing I'd say, just a bit of a piece of advice, is I think that's a really strong platform for Xero. MYOB has also tried to emulate some of those things with their own marketplace that they're building up. I do kind of go back to Microsoft as well, as Microsoft has got their whole Power App platform where more and more apps are being put onto that marketplace to leverage into Microsoft. But I'd say, look, again, my advice would be dabble in some of those add-ons, see what works. If it doesn't work, feel free to switch from those, because Xero will still remain as your accounting platform, but feel free to dabble in those different apps and see what value you can really drive. And one of the biggest things as well, just going to back to Power BI, if you do have those additional platforms, chances are Power BI will be able to tap into it, or likely those add-ons have built in a Power BI add-on for visualization elements. So it's a really good place to explore, and I often get lost in the sort of range of apps that are available there.
I got a question through from Rolf. Not trying to be flippant, but how do startups afford engaging with the Big Four for anything, given controlling costs is existential, especially on a bootstrapping journey? For that one, I think I can probably throw something in the ring for that one. In that, I think you'll find. I mean, look, the thing for us, and I can only speak for Outgrows Ventures, is that the services that we offer, especially at the early stage, I think you'll find are competitively priced because they're designed for startups. So we're not actually offering the same service we would offer a Telstra to a startup. So we've taken and factored all of that in. So I think it's pretty competitive. So come and have a chat to us about it. But I think on that one, yeah, happy to address that. But the firm and probably the other Big Four that play in the same space, all of us are committed to really helping founders, and the last thing we want to do is overcharge. So I think the services, as I said, they are really specifically designed and priced. So happy to talk through or send some pricing through. And also the other thing is that most of our products are designed as to be priced at the level that you're at. So they scale, the pricing scales as you scale. So you can actually start pretty inexpensively. I've got another one coming through that really stressed me out, because it says, we've heard about the 3 Ps, people, product and process. There's a 4th philosophy, and then it said IMHO, and I was going IMHO, and then I wrote, in my humble opinion, I got it. I had to do it on my phone actually, but I got there in the end. It's important to build a solid financial foundations inside the business. The outsourced CFO should be a change agent in this process. I reckon these foundations are commercial literacy, performance visibility, rolling forecasting, aligned KPIs, metrics, and deep analysis. Would be interested in the belief set your CFOs bring. Josh.
That's a great question.
I know. Should have started with that.
So yeah, what on Michael for the curly one. And you're dead right. Every CFO is going to bring their unique beliefs and value sets and different culture. So it's about finding the right person for your business that can work with founders. I think Eddie mentioned that before, about that is almost one of the critical success factors. Finding someone who culturally can work with you. The way I view it is that as founders, you raise a new question. You don't have that innate financial knowledge necessarily, because your job and the reason why you got such a great startup business is that fact you're innovative, you're a founder, you're good at driving that sort of success in that journey. The CFO can't do that. That otherwise, hopefully, they'd be out there doing it. But what they can do is bring that skill set. So the way I think about it is, we have failed if we can't come to your business and work with you. We got the wrong person, and understand that business as well as you do as a founder. And that's obviously really hard to achieve. But most of our clients who work with us really closely say, look, we really appreciate how you get our business. You understand our unique differences, because we're not this, we're not that, we're not our competitors, we are this. And that can be a cultural difference, it could be a value proposition difference, but often they're little idiosyncrasies that are really important to get right. And if we can't understand that, then we can't understand what makes your business tick and what makes it unique in market, and therefore what's going to help us scale, and then hopefully sale as well down the track. So that's that angle. In terms of internal skill sets, yeah, completely agree. We've got to then impart that knowledge onto the founders as best we can, and also onto internal finance staff as well, and take them on that journey. And then we can work as a team, and the more we can do that, the better we can perform as well. So there's this mutual interest in doing that well, and that's where we see the best success from these sort of things.
Yeah, and look, I'd also like to add to it. I've actually been in a meeting with a bank and with a startup, and they had an outsourced CFO, right? And the one thing that the bank really loved was there was an outsourced CFO that actually already had all their questions answered. So what are the key KPIs? What's the forecast? What's the growth? And this is something the founder didn't quite think about, and probably wasn't the most financially literate person. But when you do have that outsourced CFO, they do have that level of professionalism, asking the questions, and that would normally be asked from an investor or a bank or someone that is looking to it and needs those visualizations, that trust. And so I think it was Michael who said that question too. That was a really good question. I think it's a really strong point for an outsourced CFO, is that the fact that they just do raise that level of maturity in the finance function, definitely. Yeah,
particularly with banks and institutions, or even family offices. If you're going to engage in KPMG or a Big Four, you want to leverage that brand. It is quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another one that's come through. How do you manage using multiple smaller apps with specific functions and integrating them versus using a larger app system that covers more but is exponentially more expensive? When do you upgrade, especially when some of these systems require external setup partners which add to the cost?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? And there is probably a big time element to it, right? So if you are finding there is a lot of time being spent on managing the apps, and you do need to manage a team, that's probably when there is a question of, is it worthwhile to continue, right? So I spoke earlier about the marketplace and where Xero has really sort of leveraged that as a strength, but the downside is if you do dabble in 3, 4, 5 different systems, it does become quite complicated, and the data is stored into different apps. And so there is a certain point where if you do have those systems in that ecosystem, and you are finding you're spending a lot of time working on that ecosystem, that is probably the point at which you need to look into one system that then does become sort of the core ERP system. So I haven't quite answered that question, but it is, I think once you get to that point, actually, this is probably the better way to answer it. Once you get to that point where you do have an ecosystem and you're solid and you're sort of sound with that ecosystem, that is probably a really good point to move to the ERP, because chances are your processes and your governance and people using the different apps has sort of been determined. And I think that's when you would be ready to transition, right? So I'm just going to assume that different people have ownership of different apps, which means you've already got that segregation of processes and security and different roles in the organization. And so the organization is probably set and ready to take that next jump.
Thank you, that's great. Look, I'm just conscious of time. So I think we've gone through most of the questions. I think might be time is, unless, I'll sort of throw to you guys for a couple of probably just finishing off on, if there's just a couple of practical tips you want to give people around maturing the finance function. It'd be good just to hear those, or anything you haven't had the chance to sort of talk through, or any points you wanted to make. Josh, I might throw to you first.
Yeah, I think that the key takeaway for me is you want to build that narrative. You want to build confidence and build trust. So as startups, I assume most, if not all of you, are here to grow your business and really sell that at some point in the future. So that comes down to building confidence and trust as you do that, and helping you have the information when you need it that really understands your business to drive you on that journey, and hold you accountable as well, and provide that practical insight and support as you go through that journey. So I really think about that. I do like the idea of the 4P, so thanks for throwing that in there. But yeah, think about it. Please don't think about it as a set of, a set of financials or P&Ls or board packs. Flip that in its head and really think about where you're going, what you do need to know, what you don't need to know, what success looks like, and then structure it based on that.
Right. Okay. Eddie.
Look, I guess my final point, look, as a technology person, people often ask, for the technology answer, and the way I normally respond to it is sort of that people, process, and technology answer, right? I think first, the foundation of every organization is its people, and having the right people in place and understanding the different balances, weaknesses, and strengths of different people. And then you build on top of that the processes, the governance, specific sort of rules or systems that not systems, but processes that you need to have in place on top of the people, right? And then the technology question can be answered, right? Without the right people in place, without the right processes being there, the technology isn't going to be a good investment without those two things being answered or solidified in the organization. So those are the things that I take into account. I'm always happy to explore the conversations around what the technology options and what suits best, but people, processing, technology is probably the easiest answer if you have those other two set.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks, guys. I think that was certainly covered a range of topics. There are a couple of questions we didn't get to, which, yeah, we're happy to respond to those directly. And also, if you do have any questions, reach out to us. We're always really happy to have a chat. We are in the outsource CFO area. Look, we're very experienced. Josh works with a lot of our founders, as do our teams in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane as well. So yeah, so please reach out. I hope you found this useful. And hopefully you'll join us for, I don't know when the next one is, but the next Q&A session, which won't be with Josh and Eddie, but I'll be here. So, so join us. Anyway, thanks everyone, and thanks guys.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.